Did you ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family, 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 family tree.
Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. This week's show, we're following on with our Irish ancestral connections for people of fame who discovered their Irish roots and so on. And we would have Bing Crosby today, and that's got a fascinating West Cork connection. So Bing's Harrigan connections are of great interest to us, and an awful lot of research by Dr. Buckley has been done on that. And he reckoned that there was an opportunity for the people of Schull to honour their famous son with a plaque or statue in the village centre. So Dr. Buckley spent years researching Bing Crosby's Irish roots, drawing mainly on information published by US author Joseph King, who almost 30 years ago traced Bing's Irish ancestors to a specific townland in Schull. And very, very interesting work indeed. Now, just a little bit about Bing Crosby. He was born 1903 and he died in 1977. Harry Lillis Crosby. And he's very famous as a singer. Easily one of the most important influences in the 19th century. He also gravitated towards making movies as well, with Bob Hope and so on. And of course he's most famous for an iconic song at this stage, White Christmas. His Irish ancestry, though, according to King's research, showed that Bing Crosby's maternal great-grandfather was Dennis Harrigan. And he was living in Schull parish in the late spring of 1831. And that's very telling, because Schull is quite a big area. When you look at the parish registers of Schull, you get West Schull on the NLI site and East Schull. So you're looking really, when you've got the parish of Schull, that's actually narrowing it down a little bit for a very, very big area. Now, Bing Crosby's great-grandfather was a 51-year-old farmer and carpenter, and that in 1831 he decided to relocate with his wife Catherine, who was in her early 40s, and their 10 children, to Canada. Now, the family boarded a timber sailing ship which would have sailed from West Cork to New Brunswick in Canada, and they did so with their 10 children. Isn't that something else? Age 51 and in her 40s. So they were very well able folk indeed. And Catherine then gave birth on the September the 6th, 1832, to their 11th child, Dennis Jr., who was Bing's maternal grandfather. One of Dennis Jr.'s children, Katie Harrigan, passed on her love of music and singing to her fourth born and first daughter, Catherine Helen Harrigan, who was born on February the 7th, 1873. And she gave birth to Harry Lillis Bing Crosby, and he would grow up to be one of the greatest recording stars of all time. He died in 1977. So, what kind of records can we hope to get? When I was looking for the sources, one of the things that would strike you is when you're looking at the tithe allotments, you can't find the parish of Schull, because, of course, that is a Catholic parish. And therefore you have to use resources like S.W. Wilson and so on, and other sources such as John Grenham's and irishtownlands.ie to start narrowing down what parishes belong to which parish and so on. you've got to be aware of the Catholic and civil parish anomalies, because if you're not, you're going to find it very hard to actually trace your Irish ancestry as such. So basically what we've got here, we've got a man of 51 married to a lady in her, married a long time with 10 children, but she was slight 11-year distance maybe between them, and they emigrating to New Brunswick. And the house in Schull has been found, and the remains of it are overgrown and so on. And Dr. Buckley believed that that's where Mr. Harrigan would have stored. They knew quite a lot about him, that he used to like to smoke a clay pipe and so on. Bing's ancestral home is further supported by the fact that a collection of coastal rocks nearby are named after the family, who would have had a right to harvest seaweed in the area for use as nutrients for potato growing on their land. So Schull is on the coast, on the Mizzen Peninsula, a beautiful area, and it would have given them a great deal of fortitude and ability to not be afraid to make that long journey that they did. So Bing came from a particular townland outside Schull. And funny enough, it was hard enough to find the connections. He arrived in Schull and inquired that it was about this particular townland, and told that it was a few miles outside the village. Now, one of the aspects are, when you're doing genealogy, people don't necessarily like to give away all their sources. So you find that in newspapers and in sources that I was looking at here, that you do have to do the digging yourself, and you have to be careful that you're narrowing it down. So you have Schull Parish in the southwestern region of County Cork in Ireland, ushering his family aboard a timber ship bound for New Brunswick, Canada, leading his wife Catherine and 9 of their 10 children onto the creaking deck. Dennis knew what to expect of the gruelling voyage. Still, he counted himself lucky for members of his congregation that were able to leave it all. Out of the 65,000 emigrants who set sail in 1831, only 90 or so from tiny Schull could afford passage, not many of them Catholic. So they were a brave, resolute lot. This comes from a New York account, if you like, and they gazed westward with tenacious faith as the ship cleared Ireland's southernmost point, the Mizzen Head of southwest Cork's Mizzen Peninsula, once a haven for smugglers and pirates who sought refuge in its impregnable coves. So what a wonderful description there. It was a Canadian-built vessel, and it wasn't designed for carrying passengers, because it was designed to bring over freight, and they started to make money bringing passengers back. That's how that emigration occurred. So it was used for transporting timber, and then they decided to take human cargo on their way back. And that was New Brunswick's primary export. To maximise efficiency, the shipbuilders hastily modified the holds and lowered passengers' fares by more than 2/3 to start. This is an excellent way of making a few pounds, and what you had a number of Irish families emigrating and generating the slogan, quote, "Timber in, passengers out." Dozens of these ships were lost at sea, and many more were decimated by typhus, dysentery and other diseases. All were cursed with conditions as barbarous as those of slave ships: insufficient food supplies, inadequate sanitation and gender partition, little if any ventilation, berths half as high as those required by law for slavers. The journeys averaged 6 weeks, and the only music heard was the shrift wail of the increasing lamentations. The wilderness of Canada's eastern provinces promised to be friendlier to the Harrigans. Dennis's siblings had bought over their families the previous year. Now Dennis removed his own family, all but his married daughter Ellen Sauntry, who arrived in New Brunswick 20 years later as a widow with 7 children, 14 years before the Great Hunger and before the tidal wave of Irish emigration that flooded America's urban centres. So this is 1831, where you've got what's known as chain migration. And when you look at the 1901 census for the Harrigans, and you try and find traces of them in Schull, you'll find none. You won't find many anyway. So this was an area that teamed with the Harrigans, and therefore the Tithe of Blockmans is a really good place to start. Now there's a strong trade element of fisher folk and carpentry and so on, and that may make an influence in the agricultural lines of what you find. But it's an absolutely fascinating story of what sources you can use and so on. So you have typical emigration, timber in, people out, if you like, and so on, and you've got the human cargo, and you have the names of the Mizzen Peninsula's Catholic congregants who left that season, and in harder ones to follow, taking root all over America. Fitzgeralds, Driscolls, Regans, Harrigans, Sullivans, Donovans, Coughlins, O'Briens, Hickeys, Mahoneys. They had abandoned an old world and were embracing a new. And 100 years had passed, this is from an account, where Jonathan Swift offered his modest proposal to abate Ireland's poverty, beggary and congestion by cannibalising its popish offspring. So there's quite a lot against these poor emigrants and so on, and how they're actually seen. Most likely the Harrigans were Gaelic speaking, not English, and could not read at all. They were tough, hard-working, close-knit, intensely religious and musical. A legend passed down into the 20th century traces the family's genesis to John of Skibbereen, a town some 12 miles east of Schull, who may have been Dennis Harrigan's father and was known as Organ O'Brien for his fine playing of the church instrument. The importance of music and dance in the 19th century Ireland could hardly be overstated. The amusements provided as much solace as the church. And when the ship finally docked, the Harrigans made their way through the Miramichi section of New Brunswick to the outlying woods of the Williamstown settlement, 6 miles inland, where they learned to clear land for tillage and built log cabins that furnished little protection against the winter's freezing temperatures. Dennis's 9 children ranged in age from 1 to 20. Remember, one of them, his daughter, was married to Santry. She emigrated later on as a widow with 7 children. He made capable carpenters of his sons. Williamstown's Catholic settlers were from the Mizzen Peninsula and were powerfully united by culture and custom. The strongest bond was religion, strengthened by the prejudices of the Irish Methodist who proceeded against them and so on. So you have quite a lot going on there with what's happening. And they had a lot of linkages. So they were actually quite tough, well-able people. Now, one of the things that they did was they moved, though. So the family, Catholic Harrigan, in her early 40s, gave birth on September the 6th, 1832, to her 11th child, the only one born in North America, Dennis Jr. And that would have greatly surprised Bing Crosby to learn that his maternal grandfather was Canadian. He assumed he was of Irish birth, and wrote as much in his memoir and on his mother's death certificate. When Bing attempted to trace the family line during a visit to Ireland, he was thwarted by his certainty on the matter. If Dennis Sr. embodied the trials of transatlantic resettlement, his son, born in New Brunswick, baptized in St. Patrick's in Miramichi, would have personified the westward journey into and across the United States. So you can see what happens. A family says, well, he was born in Ireland, and it is so much of a wish that all would be born in Ireland that it gets taken as fact. And that's something for our listeners to be aware of, that sometimes what we hear and what we think is true and what we cannot be convinced of is definitely not the case. So Protestants and Catholics worked together, united by a hostile environment. Dennis Harrigan's appointment as overseer of the highway in 1839 affirmed the increasingly significant presence, and but Catholics were criminalised, and there was bias against them, and so on. So one of these things, a lot of things are happening in Williamstown that are replicating religious divides that come from across the waters and so on, and it's important to see that. Dennis and Catherine passed away within a few years of each other and are presumably buried in the church marked unmarked graves in Red Bank on the Miramichi River. They were almost certainly gone by 1866, the year several of their children, now in their 30s and 40s, left for Maine, Wisconsin and Minnesota. Dennis Jr., however, remained another 15 years. So you see them moving out of where they are and moving on to other places. And that shows how strong the linkages are. So Dennis Jr. was one of the most industrious and devout of his father's sons, and they two or three of the brothers didn't get as good a reputation. They were not given that kind of credit, and he eventually earned a reputation as a reliable, proficient contractor and builder, specialising in church architecture. And so that would be Bing Crosby's grandfather, you know, and you can see their journey of the Crosby generation. The Crosbys are Scots-Irish and so on. So that's very significant as well. So you've got both sides of ancestry, English, Scottish, and Irish, if you like. The Crosbys, Scotch, English. So you're seeing a combination there. Kate Harrigan, who advanced the family's musical calling, and in this account, she not only baked a wonderful pie, but sang like a bird, and it was common gossip when she was out rowing on the lake that either Kate Harrigan or an angel is out there singing. Her boys were raised to be practical. In Larry's account, Dennis wisely brought up 4 of his sons to be respectively lather, plumber, plasterer and electrician. They could build a house or win a fight without any outside help. Singing was a pastime, hardly a profession. 2 grandchildren of Ellen Sawntry, first cousins of Dennis Jr., won renown on the stage, and that may not have been seen as being great. It was kind of seen as being immoral. Katie passed on her love of music to Catherine Helen Harrigan, who was delivered in February 1873, and you know, she would have Bing. Bing was one of her own children. And how he got his nickname is really important. It was from actually playing cops and robbers and pulling out his little toy gun and going bing, bing, bing. That's because he was actually Harry Lillis Crosby, and his father was Harry Lillis Crosby Sr. So very significant in how what happens there. And Catherine was born, Bing's mother was born, and they moved to a large boarding house on Main Street. And many of its 30 or so tenants were from New Brunswick. Dennis partly owned part of the house, but they would have been moved up in the world, and they started building things and building the first Catholic, Methodist and Presbyterian churches. He took his family back to St. Paul's, and there Catherine, Bing's mother, aged 12, and her brother Edward spent their afternoons making and demonstrating ice skates. They were obliged to earn their keep, a Harrigan practice that Catherine, who could skate her name on ice, instilled on her own children. So they were a hard-working lot, the Harrigans, and they were well able to make a living in very tough times. They were influenced by the railroad, and that influenced their movement of where they could go, because Dennis was 57, old for carpentry, but he had established himself as a contractor and built several notable structures, including Seattle's Hull's buildings and Tacoma Aquinas Academy Annex, Scandinavian Church and Dominican Sisters Convent. So one of the things here that we get this very strong Irish connection. We get Bing thinking that his grandfather was actually born in Ireland, but he wasn't. He was born in Canada and so on. So we really do get a wonderful sense of how to do our Irish ancestry. Now, the NLI, the National Library of Ireland, the Catholic Parish Registers, are very, very useful, but just be aware that you're looking at Schull Parish here and a hinterland around it, and Schull East and Schull West are massive, massive areas. This is a very large peninsulas and so on. And they stick together. They have to stick together to survive. And it creates those links where they stick together when they emigrate to New Brunswick in Canada, and when they move on, even when they move on from Canada to St. Paul's and so on, they're always travelling together within the one network and the one branch. So these are very telling indeed. Now, when I looked at the 1901 and 1911 census, I could see that the Harrigans were no longer around that Schull Peninsula. There might be one or two families left perhaps, but nothing to the extent that they had been in the 1830s. Why did 65 families go and so on, and 65 names? Why are they going at that time in 1831? Well, because perhaps there are land clearances, so on. Perhaps there is disease such as cholera, which they are escaping. Lots of things are happening in between the 1820s and the 1840s, long before the famine, and long before Bing's great-great aunt would have had to emigrate as a widow with 7 children, with her Saunter's first cousins and so on. So that's all for today, and it's been great to tell you all about the ancestry of Bing Crosby. I'll be over in the London Family History Fair this Saturday, so if any of you are there, please do look me up if you're going to Sandown Racecourse. It'd be lovely to meet up with you and have a chat about Irish ancestry. I'm giving a talk for my heritage and so on. And of course, I'll be running the school in Nina in County Tipperary in May, and if you have inquiries about that, please do contact me and let me know. So look at our sources today. I did look at the tithe allotments, which could be very telling indeed. I looked at the 1901-1911 census. I looked at John Grenham's, and I looked at various little geographical influences of what's happening in Schull as well, because place and space are very important with Irish ancestry.
Did you ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family tree.